Hello, lords and ladies! Welcome to Of Swords and Magic, discussions about Arthurian legend. My name is LJ, and I welcome you to my first episode. Woohoo! I'm so excited. I've been wanting to do this for a really long time now, and now I finally have a little bit of time to do it. So I thought I'd make an episode, I'd make a podcast about Arthurian legend and its literature and characters and themes and portrayals of the characters throughout the ages, and how Arthurian legend is still relevant today, because it is. So if you're just kind of sort of into Arthurian legend and just kind of looking to learn a little bit more about the characters, or maybe you're just trying to pass your English test on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and don't really feel like reading it, or maybe you're an expert and you just kind of want something to listen to in the car, or maybe you just like Monty Python. Whatever your reason for being here, you've come to the right place. So welcome. Just a little bit about myself. My name is LJ. I'm a recent college graduate with a degree in performing arts and a serious love for Arthurian literature, if you couldn't already tell. I first got into Arthurian literature when we had to learn about, I think it was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or maybe it was Le Morte d'Arthur, I can't quite remember, but we had to learn about it in our English class in high school, and I fell in love with it. And then I took a class with my friend Elena in college, an Arthurian legend class, and I fell even more in love with it and realized that it's something that I'm way more passionate about than I thought, and now I'm making a podcast because why not? And it's something that I love very dearly and would hopefully like to teach one day when I'm in my 50s or 60s or whatever, and I've done my fair share of theater and lived my life and traveled, blah blah blah. Maybe one day I'll be sitting in a cozy sweater with a cup of hot tea and glasses and teaching a bunch of kiddos about Arthurian literature. That's the dream. Anyway, welcome to my podcast. We are going to, today, discuss all the characters. Today is going to be a beginner's guide to Arthurian literature. So if you consider yourself an expert, maybe you might want to just wait a little bit till the next episode. Hopefully, I don't know how often I'll be able to make these because I'm actually really busy, but I'm going to try to make them as often as I can. So anyway, if you feel fairly familiar with Arthurian literature and you want to skip to the next couple episodes, feel free. And if you're not, and you'd like to know a little bit more about these characters and about what they do and everything, now's the time to listen. So I'm going to just kind of discuss the main characters that you need to know. This is a beginner's guide, so we're just going to discuss the main characters. There's a ton of characters in Arthurian legend, but we're just going to discuss the main ones that you need to know and what they do and what they've done, etc. And the main plot structure that usually happens in most adaptations. There's so many different plot structures that happen in all the different stories because there's so many varieties of ways to tell Arthurian legend stories, but there's always a couple particular things that always happen, and there's a couple characters who always remain the same. So we're going to discuss those so you know what's going on. So then the next episodes you'll be able to know who's who and who did what, blah blah blah. Cool? Cool. So let's... Oh, also, real quick, I used to do a Tolkien podcast discussing things about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all that with my friend Elena. It was called There and Back Again, Tales of Two Tolkienites. So hopefully I'll be able to have her on as a guest at some point, which would be really great because she also loves Arthurian literature. And I also have a friend Alyssa who would also love to be on, so maybe we'll have the honor of having her on as well. In the meantime, I'm going to take a little bit of the structure that we used, me and Elena, for our podcast before, for this one. So before we get into the main section of the podcast, I'm going to do a little bit of news regarding medieval things and literary things, just for fun. Why not? Also, we used to do a thing called On This Day in medieval times, so we would get all of this information usually from medievalist.com or .net or whatever, which was a really cool website that would tell you what happened on this day in medieval times. So we'll do a little bit of that just for fun, just to kind of get a little bit warmed up and talk about some cool news that's going on in the world regarding medieval literature and things regarding Arthurian legend as well. Okay, so today in 1066, today is January 4th, by the way, 2018. Today in 1066, Edward the Confessor died, and in 1236, King Henry married Eleanor of Provence. I don't know why that's relevant to this podcast, but I just thought I'd throw that in there because it's cool, and it regards medieval stuff. So, now you know. Arthurian news. There's no, not to my knowledge, there's no books or any new special things coming out. However, I don't know if y'all watch this, I doubt you do, but there's a series called Nightfall, spelled K-N-I-G-H-T, Nightfall, on the History Channel, which is about King Philip of France and all that happened during the Crusades and the Holy Wars and all that stuff. But it's kind of cool because it's historical in that sense, but it also has a sort of an Arthurian twist because Gawain and Percival are in it, who are knights of the Round Table, and we'll talk about them a little later. Also, the main character, Sir Landry, is basically Lancelot. He has an affair with the Queen, and he's the king's best friend, so it's a similar Lancelot-Guinevere story, which we'll also discuss later. Landry, Lancelot, similar names, you get it. Anyway, it's about the Holy Grail and its relation to the Holy Wars. Anyway, so check it out if you get the chance. It's really great. It comes on every Wednesday at 10 p.m. on the History Channel. They're not paying me to say this. I just want to say it because it's great. And that's Arthurian news for today. So, without further ado, let's get started with our main segment. Alrighty, welcome to the main segment, a beginner's guide to Arthurian legend. Let's talk about these characters, shall we? I think we should first start with, not with King Arthur, but with King Arthur's parents, because that's how that baby gets born. So we're gonna first start with King Uther. All Arthurian legend always begins with King Uther. King Uther was the king of Camelot, or Quimdir? I don't know how to pronounce the name in Welsh, but Camelot goes by many names. But we're going to stick with Camelot, because that's the name that everybody knows. So, Camelot in Britain. King Uther was the king of Camelot, and sometimes he was considered a very good and nice king that everybody loved, and in other adaptations he's considered a king that everybody feared and everyone hated, because he was unjust. Is that a word? Unjust? He did not rule well. But sometimes he's considered a great guy, so I don't know, it depends on the story. But anyway, King Uther ruled Camelot, and he married a woman named Igraine, Y-G-R-A-I-N-E, Igraine. She became the queen, and she was very kind and caring, and she was usually blonde. She had hair of the sun, as some of the stories say. And the two of them, Uther and Igraine, had a daughter named Morgan Le Fay, or Morgaine, as she's called in other adaptations, or in some it's Morgana, it depends. She also has many names. I'm gonna call her Morgaine. So, they have this lovely daughter named Morgaine who has magic. She has some sort of druidic gift, and we're gonna get into that later. We're also gonna talk about Morgaine later, and we're gonna leave her for now, but we're gonna keep coming back to her, so do not forget Morgaine, because she's very important. So anyway, they have this daughter named Morgaine, but they need a son, because an heir to the throne couldn't possibly be a woman, because a woman couldn't sit on the throne unless she was married to a man. Ridiculous. So Uther goes to his friend, or he's not really a friend, he's an acquaintance. He goes to his acquaintance, an old man in the forest, an old hermit, named Merlin, or Merlin the Wise. He was a wizard. If you're really, really unfamiliar with Arthurian legend, if you remember The Sword and the Stone, I'm sure everybody's seen that, the Disney movie. The old clumsy wizard guy in the cottage who teaches the little boy all the stuff and turns him into a bunch of animals. That guy, that's Merlin. So Uther goes to Merlin and says he needs his wife to have a son. So he asks Merlin to come up with some sort of magic concoction to help his wife bear them a son. So that's exactly what he does. He uses magic, and thus, in 9 months, Igraine gives birth to a smiling little baby boy named Arthur. Woo! And thus begins Arthurian legend. And also thus, and always remember this, Arthur was born of magic. Very, very important. Keep that in mind. So, from this point, there are 2 ways to tell the story. So we're gonna go down both ways so that you know. Try to make it as brief as possible. Okay, so, first way to tell the tale. Way number 1. Because Arthur is born of magic, and magic is forbidden in Camelot, this is just in this version. Because magic is forbidden in Camelot and Arthur was in fact born of magic, Arthur is taken to a castle in the middle of nowhere, in some forest, raised by one of King Uther's knights, called Sir Ector, and Sir Ector's son, Kay. And then they named Arthur Wart. Isn't that the most saddest thing you've ever heard? Can you imagine if your name was Wart? How sad would your life be? You are setting that kid up for failure! Wart was spelled W-A-R-T, BT dubs. So, now we have 2 more characters introduced to the story, Sir Ector and his son, Kay, who raise Arthur. Sir Ector is one of King Uther's knights. He's really not that important. That's all you need to know about him. Kay, however, is very important for all ways to tell the story. Kay is the jerk older brother. That's what you need to know about him. He's rude, snotty, pompous, selfish, ungrateful. Little bastard. He's that one guy in everybody's family that nobody enjoys being around. That brings everybody down. He's the worst. But, you know, he has redeeming qualities. He's skillful in battle and whatever, and he's good with a sword and whatnot. He's not even chivalrous, so I can't even say that about him. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, so Sir Kay, the snotty older brother, and Sir Ector, who's actually kind of a really nice guy, help raise Wart. And it kind of becomes a sort of a Cinderella story. Maybe that's where the Cinderella story came from. They got it from this. These are the things I think about at night. So Kay and Ector make Arthur do all the household chores. They make him work because Ector never wanted a son anyway, and he's like, why do I have to raise this kid? He's supposed to be king, but whatever. It's not my fault. This kid was born of magic, but here I am, stuck raising him because the king asked me to. God, I hate my life. So they raise Arthur and make him do all this stuff and make him clean and cook and blah, blah, blah. 12 years later, 12 years they were doing this. 12 years later, Ector's friend, one of the other knights, Sir Pellinore, comes to the castle that's in the middle of nowhere and delivers the news of the New Year's tournament. There's going to be a tournament on New Year's Day, and the winner will be crowned king because King Uther and Igraine have died. Oh, also, Igraine died in childbirth. She died giving birth to Arthur. I should have mentioned that earlier. Sorry about that. But Uther has recently died. He just died of old age or what have you. So now they need a new heir to the throne because everybody forgot about Arthur. And Morgane, remember Morgane? Yeah, she's there. She has the rightful place to the throne, but she can't rule because she's a woman. That poor girl. Anyway, so Sir Ector hears about this and he's like, okay, we need to train you, Kay, so that you can go and become king. So meanwhile, they train Kay super hardcore and he practices every day, blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, Arthur is stuck doing all the chores and his life sucks and he's really sad. And then Ector makes Kay dub him his squire. And Kay's like, but I don't want to. He's this gross little servant boy. And eventually Ector convinces him to do it, so he dubs Arthur his squire. And Arthur's like, really? Me? I get to be your squire? And he's so excited, and he gets to do all of the beginnings of knightly duties that are required of a squire. And he learns about armor, and he learns about training, and he learns about weapons, and he learns about all these cool things, because now he gets to be a squire. Meanwhile, while Kay is super hardcore training on his own, Arthur somehow mysteriously runs into the old hermit wizard, Merlin, and they introduce themselves, and they become best friends. Just kidding, they don't become best friends yet. But they become really good friends, and they start to learn things from each other, and Merlin decides to train Arthur himself. Not for the tournament to be king, but he decides to train Arthur in the ways of the mind. He trains him in the ways of how to be king mentally, which is pretty cool. And way more important. I'm just kidding, it's not way more important, but it is pretty important. So while Kay is training to become king physically, Arthur is training on how to become king mentally, with Merlin, which is a little more impressive. Okay, so then the tournament happens. The day of the tournament arrives. It's New Year's Day, start of a new year, new me, blah, blah, blah. They're really excited. Kay's like, I'm gonna become king. And so he calls his squire, Wart, over to him, and he's like, okay, it's time, where's my sword? And Arthur's like, I forgot it. And Kay's like, excuse me? And Arthur's like, I think I left it at home, I don't know where it is, And so Arthur knows that he has to go all the way back to the inn where they're staying for this tournament to get the sword that he left, but the inn is way far away, and he won't be able to get there in time enough, to get there and back in time enough for the tournament. So Arthur is panicking, and he tries to look around for a sword. This is the part that's a little funny, because it's an old story, but he goes into the forest in search of a sword, because of course there's gonna be swords in the forest. Oh, Arthur. Anyway, he goes in the forest, and he comes upon a magical sword that's stuck fast in solid stone. And he sees the sword, and he's like, oh my goodness, look, it's a sword. So then he goes to the sword, and he pulls it out like it's nothing. No big deal, just pulls the sword out of this giant rock. And runs back to the village, and, not the village, well, I guess it is a village, but to the castle where the tournament's happening in Camelot. And everybody sees the sword, and they're like, oh, that's the magical sword from the stone in the forest! And Arthur's like, the what? I'm just grabbing my sword from my brother. And they're like, no, that's the magical sword! You pulled it out of the stone! How is this possible? And he's like, what did I do? And soon Arthur finds out that the stone that the sword was stuck in had an inscription. And the inscription said, whosoever pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king, born of all England. Ba ba ba! And so Arthur becomes king, like he was supposed to, after all. And the Cinderella story is complete, and he leaves his rags and goes to riches. And he's like, bye, Hector, bye, Kay. Except it's not bye to Kay, because Kay becomes one of his knights at the round table, unfortunately. He pulls a Cinderella, and he's like, I forgive you, it's okay. And Kay's like, cool, I'm gonna be your best knight. And then he ends up being that same guy in everyone's family that everybody hates. But it's okay. Arthur's cool and merciful and forgiving, so it's fine. And then the Arthurian legend continues, and Arthur grows up and makes all of these Knights of the Round Table, and that's where we stop with the first way to tell that tale, okay? So that was way number 1. Cool. The second way is much briefer. Briefer? Is that a word? It is now. Is much briefer. So way number 2 of telling that tale is that Arthur was already raised as royalty. He was never taken away by Sir Ector and raised by Ector and Kay. He was never called Wart. He was always called Arthur, and he was raised by Uther. Igraine did die in childbirth, but Uther raised him to be king. And eventually Uther died in Arthur's teen years. And I think it's fairly recently after Uther died and Arthur has his coronation to become king. Arthur's doubting himself, and he's like, I'm not fit to be king, I don't know what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. I need help. And Merlin has already been helping him, but it's still not enough to convince him that he is good enough to be king. So one day this contest is heard of to pull a sword out of a stone in the forest. And Merlin suggests that Arthur goes and pulls the sword out. And Arthur's like, are you kidding me? It's stuck fast in solid stone. I can't pull that out. And Merlin's like, I believe in you. Yes, you can. And maybe this will prove to everybody that you can, in fact, be king, because it was only meant for one person to pull out of the stone, and that one person is you. So he convinces Arthur to go to the forest to try to pull it out. And everybody hears that King Arthur is going to go to the forest to pull the sword out. Maybe he was prince. Maybe Uther didn't die yet. Maybe Uther was on his deathbed and was going to die because he was still prince when he pulled it out. So anyway, Prince Arthur goes to the forest to pull out the sword from the stone. Everybody hears about it. Everybody's like, oh my god, he's going to pull the sword out of the stone, blah, 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 blah. He goes to the forest. Arthur's sweating. His palms are sweating. He's like, I can't do this. I can't do this. And Merlin's like, believe in yourself. Yes, you can. And sure enough, Arthur pulls the sword out of the stone and becomes right-wise king, born of all England. And then Uther dies, and Arthur becomes king, and everybody believes in him and loves him, not just because he pulls a sword out of a stone, but also because he was a great, loving, caring, merciful, and wise king. So yay! Now you know the beginning of Arthurian legend. Now we can get into all of the rest of the characters, which there are many, many of, but we're not going to get into all of them. Of course, we're just going to get into the main ones. Starting with Arthur's knights. When he becomes king, he grows up a little bit, he starts learning from Merlin, and he starts knighting some men so that he can have the Knights of the Round Table. So, we're just going to go down the list, and I'm just going to name a couple of the main knights that you need to know. We'll just go down the list and kind of describe a couple of them. If they've done significant things, we'll mention that as well. But we'll try to keep it brief. Also, before we start, just for those who don't know, the Round Table. Why is it called the Round Table? Because it's round. Also because it's round because Arthur, when he became king, believed that there should be no head at the table, that everyone was equal. And he believed that beyond just his knights. He believed that everyone was equal, whether peasant or king, no matter what color skin, no matter what gender, no matter anything. Which is why, to this day, I still believe him to be the best king that ever lived. One of them, at least. If he did in fact live. Who knows? Maybe this is all made up. But I can dream. Okay, so, the first knight that we should mention is one that I'm sure you all know, or at least have heard of, Sir Lancelot. He was sweet and handsome, kind, charming, dreamboat, great fighter. He's the idealistic version of a knight. Most idealistic version of a knight that anyone could ever dream of. All the ladies loved him, they fawned over him, they wept in the streets when he passed by on horseback because he was so beautiful. And also because he was so sweet and kind. The amount of chivalrous things that he did for ladies are uncountable and numerous beyond belief. But he didn't care about all those ladies because his heart only belonged to one woman. Queen Guinevere, who becomes Arthur's wife, which we'll get to in a little bit. I'm sure you all know that love triangle, but we'll get to that when we mention Guinevere. Also, Lancelot became one of King Arthur's best friends, besides Merlin. Lancelot was his most trusted knight, and was soon to stab him in the back. But that's okay. We'll get to that later, and it's also not Lancelot's fault. Other than the whole Guinevere affair, Lancelot was a pretty great guy. He was a great fighter, really kind, sweet, charming. And not the kind of guy that tries to be charming, the kind of guy that naturally is really sweet and kind and doesn't realize it. The best. So that's Lancelot. Number 2, Sir Bedivere, one of the first knight, he was the first knight of the Round Table. Very skilled fighter, the best, in fact. A strong enforcer, is that a word? A strong, he really enforced chivalry, and he thought it was really important. So he made sure that all of the knights followed the code of chivalry. And we'll probably have an episode sometime just about chivalry and what that means. I mean, you all know what it means, but in depth. Bedivere was a rule follower. He was loyal almost to a fault. Because he was such a rule follower, he was kind of a goody two-shoes. He was the guy that would snitch on some of the other guys who weren't following all of Arthur's rules. And that kind of made him a little snotty sometimes. But, it also made him one of the most reliable knights, especially on the battlefield. So that's Bedivere. Kind of some of the descriptions describe him as a pretty big, very muscular guy. Not the most attractive, but he has a great personality. Number 3, Sir Kay. You all know about Sir Kay now. We don't need to describe him anymore. Okay. See what I did there? Okay, get it. I cracked myself up. Probably because I'm an only child. Sorry. Okay. Sir Bors. By the way, Kay's name is spelled K-A-Y, just so you know. It's not spelled any special way like K-E-I, like Rey from Star Wars. Sorry. Kay. Okay. Sir Bors. B-O-R-S. He was pretty cool. He was chivalrous, faithful, loyal. Everything that a knight should be. I can't really think of anything special about him. He killed 3 dragons once. It's pretty cool. That's about it. It's an honorable mention. In some adaptations, he's Guinevere's father. So Arthur's father-in-law. In others, he's just another random knight from Wales. He's pretty cool. We're gonna move on to Sir Gawain, because Gawain is next, and Gawain is one of my favorites. He's just a straight-up badass. In some adaptations, he's pagan. In others, he's Christian. It goes back and forth. Sometimes he's a pagan prince. In some stories, the Lady of the Lake, who gave Merlin the sword to stick in the stone. In some stories, the Lady of the Lake is actually Gawain's aunt. And in other stories, the Lady of the Lake is Gawain's mom. Or sister, or whatever. Somehow they're related. So, sometimes they call him the pagan prince. But usually he's just considered one of Arthur's knights. Also, we'll get into the Lady of the Lake in another episode. Gawain was also a ladies' man. Lancelot may have gotten the attention of all the ladies, but Lancelot is the kind of person that all the ladies, fawn over and whatever, but then Gawain is the one who actually gets all the action. He's a bit too much of a player. But that's okay, you gotta have one of those in every group, don't you? Gawain is, if you're not familiar with Arthurian legend, just think of Gawain as Flynn Rider. Okay? They're the same person, literally, in every possible aspect. The only difference possibly being that Gawain has longer hair. That's it. Gawain is very hot-headed. He acts before he thinks. He has a temper. And he doesn't really do well following rules. I mean, that's not true. Yes, he does. But sometimes he kind of goes on his own streak, and sometimes that gets Bedivere on his bad side, because Bedivere, the rule follower and the first knight of the Round Table, tries to enforce that Gawain follow the rules, and he's like, but we can't do this because Arthur said not to, and Gawain is the type of person that would say, well, screw Arthur, I'm doing it my way. That's Gawain. But if ever Arthur were to be threatened by a villain of some sort, because of Gawain's hot-headedness, Gawain is also the first person to jump in front of everybody else, including the king, and declare, this is my king. That challenge is mine. You'll not threaten him, threaten me instead. So, that's why we love him. That's Gawain. Which leads me to my favorite knight, Sir Percival. Percival is the baby of the group. Well, maybe Galahad is the baby. We'll get into Galahad in a little bit. But Percival is innocent, naive, pure of heart. He's known as the pure-hearted knight. He's a little bit on the wild side, on the untamed side, because he was raised in a forest. He has a pretty crazy story. Which, fun fact, I'm actually writing a young adult novel called Percival, about, guess what? Sir Percival and his quest for the Holy Grail. It's been in the works now since I took that course in college about Arthurian literature. He's portrayed as the fool in most adaptations. He's the only one of Arthur's knights that's the fool, and also the only one of Arthur's knights that was ever not trained to be a knight since birth. He was literally raised in a forest by his mother, and when he became a knight, had never before seen another human being in his life except his mother. So then he comes to the city of Camelot and sees all these people, and he's like, oh my god, there are other people on the planet besides me and my mother. What is this? My life is a lie. Anyway, the original author who wrote some of the original, the original story that we have of his, the author is called Chrétien. I don't know how to say his name in French. Chrétien. He died before he finished writing the story, and of course other authors have continued to finish the story and have made several endings to it and then rewritten it and blah blah blah. But I decided to write a children's version of it that's a little more kid friendly and a little more modern, just so you know, the language I mean is a little more modern. So it's a little more relatable, and I've been working on it for a while, and I'm really excited about it, and I'm getting there. I'm chugging through the chapters. So hopefully I'll finish it sometime soon, and maybe I'll be able to share it with you guys. It'd be really great. Anyway, you'll hear a lot more about Percival in the coming episodes, I'm sure. And I'm sure that there's going to be an episode at some point just about Percy. We'll get into him later. Anyway, so that's Percival. Moving on to Galahad, who is literally the same person as Percival. They're basically the same person. In a lot of adaptations, one or the other is used, and the two of them are kind of combined into one character because both of them are considered Knights of the Grail. They're both considered the pure knights. So sometimes they're considered just one character. Other times they're both used in the story, and both of them are really good friends, and they go on quests together and stuff. Galahad is a little more put together than Percival. He's a little more normal, if you will. He wasn't raised in a forest, and he wasn't raised in isolation. He was raised by his father, who was also a knight, so he's used to nobility and used to the lives of knighthood and all that's entailed. But essentially, personality-wise, they're the same person. You know, if you're really unfamiliar with Arthurian legend, you can consider Percival and Galahad as Merry and Pippin from Lord of the Rings. It's way easier. They're pretty much, their personalities match up pretty much exactly. I mean, I would say Galahad is probably Merry, because even though he's younger, technically, he's still kind of more mature and more well-read and a little more put together. And Percival is the kind of person who would ask about second breakfast and make bacon when they're trying to hide from people that are trying to kill them. So, Merry and Pippin. Anyway, yeah, that's Galahad. He's usually blonde, like Arthur. And he usually is the one that's associated with the Holy Grail. Even though sometimes Percival is as well. The original stories about the Holy Grail involve Percival instead of Galahad. They switch back and forth. You get the point. Anyway, that's Galahad, which sums up all of our knights. And those are the last two. So, those are all you really need to know. Yay! Now you all know about the Knights of the Round Table. And really, out of those, I mean, there are tons more. But really, all you need to know, the main ones you need to know, are Lancelot, Kay, Gawain, and Percival. And Galahad. But, you know, sometimes they're the same person. But anyway, those are all you need to know. And now you know them all. So yay! Now we're going to move on to Guinevere. Queen Guinevere is portrayed many different ways. Sometimes she's portrayed as this lovely, sweet, Disney princess-like woman who has birds that sing around her and do her laundry for her and will willingly fix her hair for her when she wakes up in the morning. And then other times, she's a little snobby and spoiled and really not that much fun. Honestly, I don't care for her very much. But you know, you can't love everybody. Mostly, I don't care for her because of how superstitious she is and how entitled she is. You know, Arthur's entitled too, but he treats everybody as equals. That's why there's a round table, Guinevere. Why don't you sit at it sometime? It's okay. Anyway, however, in the BBC show, the one on Netflix called Merlin. I don't know if you've seen it. If you're listening to this podcast, maybe you have. But in that show, she's portrayed as the best woman alive. She's so sweet and kind and truthful and honest and brave and loyal and courageous and doesn't take any crap from anybody. Also, she's black. Hell yes. But she's wondrous, a wondrous woman in that show. And sometimes in adaptations, some of the adaptations, sometimes she is like that. And she's just a really, really great, empowered woman. She's wonderful. And then in others, not so much. But, can't be perfect in every adaptation, I guess. She's always, well, not always, but most of the time she's very religious. By the end of the story, the Arthurian story, she usually ends up in a convent as a nun, repenting for her sins, which we shall get to in a second. She's also really superstitious. She believes in witchcraft and fairies and every possible superstitious myth thing you could possibly imagine to be true. But now we get into what everybody, I'm sure, knows about Guinevere, is her love triangle with who? Sir Lancelot, the dreamboat, of course. And of course, I'm sure we'll have another episode just about Lancelot and Guinevere. In fact, that would make a really good episode. That's a good idea. Noted. They have quite an affair, and in some adaptations it lasts a couple days, and in others it lasts years, forever. But it's okay. True love falls where it falls, and there's nothing you can do about it except try to be faithful to your husband. But it's okay. We love you, Guinevere, because you're Guinevere, and we love you mostly because Arthur loves you. Arthur loves his lady Guinevere. He loves her with all his heart, and that is the only reason why we love her. I'm just kidding. It's not the only reason, but anyway, when she is faithful to her husband, it's a lovely, lovely match, and the two of them are always perfect. Guinevere usually always has flowers by her in paintings, which is something I noticed. That's another great idea for an episode. Arthurian paintings, because there are so many. There was a revival, sort of Arthurian interest in the Victorian era, and all these paintings popped up with the topic of Arthurian legend. That's where the Lady of Shalott painting comes from that's really famous now. Another lady that was helped out by Sir Lancelot. God, he's a player. Maybe he is more of a player than Sir Gawain. Things to keep me up at night. Okay, we're gonna move on from Guinevere. She's had enough attention for now. Moving on to some villains, because sometimes Guinevere can be portrayed as a villain as well. If you've read Mists of Avalon, it's a book. It was also turned into a movie. It's kind of cheesy, but it's also pretty cool. One of my favorites. In the Mists of Avalon, this whole story was told from Morgaine's point of view, about how Guinevere is kind of the villain, which never happened before. So if you haven't seen that, I would check it out, because it's pretty cool, and it's pretty cool. It's a pretty great introduction to Arthurian legend if you're not very familiar with it. So check it out. Anyway, we're now going to get into the villain section of the characters, and there are 3, and then we'll be done, and then you'll know all the characters. But, okay, villains. We're going to go back to Morgaine. Remember Morgaine? That poor little girl who actually had the right to the throne. So, there are 2 different ways to tell this story, because now we're getting to the end of the Arthurian legend story. And remember I said some things always happen the same way, no matter the story, no matter the adaptation. So we're gonna go to the end now, because that's where all the villains come in. So we're gonna start with Morgaine and her sister. What? She has a sister? Yes, she has a sister. Her sister, Morgause, and sometimes she's a half-sister, sometimes she's a sister by blood. It depends on the adaptation. But we're gonna get into that a little bit for a second, because there are 2 different ways to tell the story. Just like the beginning, we're gonna go down both ways, okay? So, way number 1, and this version is used in Mists of Avalon, BT dubs, and a couple other adaptations, okay? Way number 1. Morgaine has a half-sister named Morgause, who was born of Uther. I think she's Uther's daughter and had a different mother. Either that or she's Igraine's daughter and had a different father. I can't quite remember. But she's Morgaine's half-sister. And she and Morgaine were very close. They grew up together. Morgause was always a little older, a little wiser. Took care of her when Mom wasn't around. And Morgause, not Morgaine, Morgause always wanted the throne. Morgaine knew that she was actually sort of heir to the throne, but she didn't, she didn't throw a fit about it. She knew that Arthur was a great little kid, a great little brother. She loved Arthur. So she knew that he would make a great king. She wasn't mad about it. But Morgause wanted the throne badly. So, eventually, when Morgaine was a little older, 11 or 12, Morgaine is taken away to Avalon, where she is trained to use her druidic magical powers. And she's trained by the Lady of the Lake. Remember we talked about the Lady of the Lake earlier? The Lady of the Lake, sometimes known as Vivienne, sometimes known as Freya. The Lady of the Lake trains Morgaine in her powers, similarly to the way Merlin trained Arthur to be king. And years later, Morgaine is grown up a little bit. Morgause is sort of out of the picture right now. Morgaine is grown up, and it is the night of Beltane. Beltane is a druid holiday, or pagan holiday, where the coming of spring is celebrated. And to do this, they have this giant festival in Avalon, where there's a big hunt for a stag. So a bunch of pagan men, join in this festivity, and they all hunt this stag or deer. And there's a virgin, and the druid ladies pick their virgin. And the virgin sits there and waits while the men hunt the stag. They go out into the forest and into the wild and find this deer, and whoever finds the deer first and kills it and brings it back to the virgin gets to take the virgin's virginity. And then the rites of Beltane commence. So, Arthur, who, being the good, kind, and accepting king that he was, who saw equality in everything, he was okay with celebrating different religions, even though he was a Christian, but he knew that his sister had magic. He knew that Merlin had magic. So paganism was, it was accepted. Even though Camelot was a Christian region, but he would sometimes sort of celebrate the pagan rituals and the pagan holidays as well, because his sister did and Merlin did, and, he wanted to take part. So he was young, in his lusty young days, teenage days, maybe a little older. And the rites of Beltane were happening on Beltane Eve. So he was like, I'm gonna go take part in the rites of Beltane over in Avalon. That'll be pretty cool, right? It'll be fun. So, he wasn't married to Guinevere yet, obviously. So, Arthur goes over to Avalon, not thinking about Morgaine. He figured Morgaine is probably busy doing her work. She probably wouldn't take part in any of these crazy festivities anyway. She's probably busy practicing her magic, whatever. She wouldn't take part in any of this hullabaloo. So, what do you think happens? Arthur goes to the rites of Beltane, puts on a mask, because all the hunters all have masks on, and guess what? The virgin also has a mask. And when the hunter, who wins the stag, and the virgin have their intercourse, usually intercourse took place in a cave. Can you imagine? Or it would take place in the Avalon Temple. So anyway, when intercourse happens, it's up to the hunter and the virgin whether or not they want to remove their masks. And usually they wouldn't want to remove their masks because, let's be real, it's a little scary, particularly for the virgin. Also, some people say that you weren't allowed to remove the masks during the rites of Beltane. So there's that. So, what do you think happens? Morgaine was, of course, the virgin. And guess who wins the Hunt of the Stag? Of course, King Arthur. So, you can guess what happens from here. They go to the Avalon Temple. They keep their masks on because Morgana's a little freaked out by all this, and possibly because they weren't allowed to remove the masks. And thus, the rites of Beltane commence. And Arthur goes back to Camelot, and he goes, wow, so much fun. I took this lady's virginity, I guess. It was really cool. Got a little action. It was great. Morgana is like, I wonder who that man is. I'll always love him. It was an experience like no other. Ugh! This is the Game of Thrones stuff. This is where Game of Thrones gets it from, folks. It comes from this. It all started with this. So 9 months later, lords and ladies, a baby boy is born named Mordred. Bum bum ba! Thus begins the beginning of the end. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about this. Okay, so, meanwhile, a couple years go by, and Morgause, who really, really, really wants the throne a lot more than Morgana does, Morgause decides to raise Mordred. I mean, Morgana is raising Mordred, but Morgause helps out, and she's like, cool, I'll be the aunt that, is around more than you are. Because Morgana is busy being the high priestess of Avalon and practicing her magic and practicing her work and blah, blah, blah. She has to live her life. She's got stuff going on. So Morgause ends up taking care of Mordred more often than Morgana does. And what do you think happens with that? Morgause decides to use Mordred as her way to get the throne back, because since he's technically born of Arthur, he's heir to the throne now. When Arthur dies, Mordred will take over the throne, because he's Arthur's son. So that means that somehow Morgause will have power because her nephew is on the throne. And since she knows her sister is not going to get the throne, and Morgause doesn't have any right to the throne because she's only a half-sister, her nephew is the next best chance. So she trains Mordred for battle to kill Arthur when he comes of age. And thus begins the beginning of the end. So, that's where we're going to stop real quick for that version of the story, okay? That's way number 1. Oh, also, just a theory I came up with. Morgana, Morgause, Mordred. Isn't that so funny? Those are the 3, quote-unquote, villains of the Arthurian legend. And isn't it so funny that all of their names begin with M-O-R? I wonder if that's the foundation for where the word morbid came from. Do you think? I don't know. Another thing that keeps me awake at night. Okay, so, way number 2. Way number 2 is much briefer, as it usually tends to be. Way number 2. Morgana was actually straight up evil from the beginning. She wanted the throne. She thought that she deserved to be on the throne. Just because she's a woman doesn't mean anything. She should be able to rule just like anybody else, like any other man. So she decides to take matters into her own hands and take the throne back herself. So she tries to have Arthur killed. She goes through a series of attempts to have Arthur killed so that she can have the throne. She even, when Uther was alive, attempts to kill Uther so she can have heir to the throne, not thinking that Arthur would assume the throne because he was born of magic. But, things happen. So, one particular time when Morgana tries to have Arthur killed, they finally realize that Morgana is in fact the one trying to have Arthur killed, and they seize her for treason and send her away. She is banished from Camelot, and they send Morgana away to a valley or to a forest or to a deserted, isolated land of some sort. Sometimes it's the Valley of the Fallen Kings. Other times it's the Isle of Morks. It depends on the adaptation, but she's sent away to some isolated, barren land. And there she lives out the rest of her adult years. However, she's never usually alone. She usually has a group of knights, or she has some sort of wild beasts that are controlled by her magic, or she has a group of baby dragons. It depends. Or sometimes it's just Morgause. It depends on the adaptation again. So, Eventually, Mordred is born, and we don't know who the father is. Perhaps it's one of Morgaine's knights that she keeps with her, one of her warriors, or some pagan guy. I don't know. But Mordred is born, and she still trains Mordred. She trains Mordred herself on how to defeat Arthur. He's not Arthur's son, but she does train him for battle because she predicts that one day there will be a battle between the Christians and the pagans, meaning between Camelot and Avalon. And she readies her son to kill Arthur so that Mordred will take over Camelot and assume the throne. And even though Morgaine won't be sitting on the throne, she'll at least be in power because her son will be on the throne. Okay, so that's way number 2. Just so you can kind of get an idea of different ways the story is told. It doesn't really matter, but just so you have an idea of the different ways. Okay? So that's way number 2. Now, we're going to combine both ways because the same thing happens no matter what the adaptation is. Every single time it happens the same way. Ready? Here's what happens. Giant battle happens. Big, huge war happens in Camlann. 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 And this giant war breaks out between Camelot and usually it's the Saxons. And sometimes it's these pagan, some other pagan culture, some other pagan land. But most of the time it's the Saxons. Camelot against the Saxons, and Mordred sits at the head of the Saxon army, with Morgaine watching from afar. So, the battle commences, the final battle begins, and everybody's fighting, and Mordred and Arthur are head-to-head on the battlefield, and Morgaine is watching from afar, and Merlin is watching from afar. Sometimes, if it's really epic, Morgaine and Merlin are battling themselves with magic, battling each other with magic, while everybody else, all the mortals, the humans, are fighting with weapons. So boring. Anyway, the battle's happening. Mordred has Arthur at a disadvantage, and Mordred takes his sword and plunges it through Arthur's good, noble heart, and Arthur dies. The end. I'm just kidding. That's not the end. It kind of is. But Mordred kills Arthur. The same thing happens. No matter the adaptation, the same thing always ends up happening. Now, Morgaine, in some adaptations, feels horrendous and feels like a terrible human being for what she's done, and she runs to Arthur's side, and she weeps and weeps, and she takes him to Avalon herself to die in peace, away from the battle, away from the blood, away from the frenzy, and takes him to the Lady of the Lake, or just takes him to the Lake of Avalon, and sends him away in a boat to the Isle of Avalon, where he can rest in peace forever. Other times, Merlin takes Arthur away to Avalon. Other times, Sir Bedivere takes Arthur away to Avalon, because Bedivere was Arthur's first knight of the Round Table. It depends, but Arthur always ends up going to Avalon and being placed in a boat and sent into the Lake of Avalon to rest in peace for all eternity. Mordred dies also by the hand of Arthur, because usually the two of them stab each other at the same time. Talk about epic sword fight. Mordred always dies by Arthur's hand as well. So he dies. Morgaine weeps over him. If Morgause is on the battlefield, she weeps over him, because now she doesn't have a right to the throne anymore. That's all she cared about. But yeah, so Mordred dies. Many of Arthur's knights die. Usually Percival ends up living. Usually Lancelot ends up living. And Bedivere. Those are usually the only knights that survive, and then they have to give in to the Saxon army, who has won. Camelot doesn't even win. It's the Saxon army that wins. But you know what? If the Saxons didn't win, we wouldn't be speaking the English language that we do today. Fun fact, everybody. We'll get into that later in another episode. But yeah, so back to Arthur. The legend always ends with this wonderful saying that Arthur is the once and future king. Kind of like how Jesus will always be resurrected again, right? That's a great idea for another episode, the religious context in Arthurian legend. That's a great idea. Okay, so Arthur is the once and future king and will rise again when Albion's need is greatest. That's the famous line. The once and future king who will rise again. So one day Arthur will return and we will have hope restored back to our lands. And thus the Arthurian legend is complete! Yay! Now you guys know the entirety of Arthurian legend in a nutshell. How long is this episode? Like an hour? We covered this in about an hour, guys. That's pretty great. Okay, cool. So we're gonna wrap this up here, guys. Thank you for joining me, for listening. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. Now you know all the characters and who they are and what they did, what they're known for, etc. And now you'll know what's going on in the stories that we share in the upcoming episodes. If you have any suggestions for topics for the next episodes, please feel free to share. Message me on Facebook. My Facebook page is facebook.com/ofswordsandmagic. So please feel free to check it out and feel free to send me a message. I'll definitely get back to you. And if you have any suggestions for just other suggestions not regarding topics, feel free to let me know. Or even if you just want to send some feedback. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, so please hit me up with them messages. Once again, my name is LJ. Thank you again for joining me, and I hope to see you next time on Of Swords and Magic.